Today we're going to add 6 different capabilities to the C64. We're going to add a full computer, we're going to add Ethernet, Wi-Fi, 4 USB ports, another HDMI, a rechargeable 9-volt power supply, and a keyboard port. I suppose that actually makes it 7, doesn't it? Regardless of the number of capabilities we're going to add to the C64, we are only going to modify the US version of the C64. The European version will remain untouched. However, very, very worried. I'm Mr. Gigabytes, and this is Gigabytes Technology. Okay, let's get right into it, shall we? I've had to do a lot of prep work in preparation for this video, primarily because for time, and nobody really wants to see me on the struggle bus trying to cut and chip away at the case plastics at 10x speed, no matter how rockin' a chip tune I put behind it. So, a couple of things that I've done off camera. Number one, I drilled and tapped this hole and put a standoff here, and the standoff is approximately the same size as this one here, and you'll see how that goes together in a minute. I've also cut and prepped the USBs for the keyboard and for the tail that goes into the main circuit board. I've obviously cut this standoff here. It's a standoff just like these, because the best place to place the Raspberry Pi is in this corner. And of course I've cut this out. I've cut the back out for the ports back here. I also placed and cut all of the holes for the various functions that we're going to do, and also here for these various functions. Now, the case itself was pretty easy to cut into. I basically started by drilling holes, and actually you can see that very well here. So I started drilling a hole here and on the other side, and then I would just square them off with a razor blade, and just chipped away a little bit at a time. I checked everything for fit and made sure nothing was interfering with anything else. Back here, I had to countersink some of the holes because some of my screws were a little short, and you can see the little stud poking out down here for that little standoff I placed. Now, there's going to be quite a few functions put into this C64, and let's just get started installing them. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and install our charging unit. So this is going to be our 9-volt power supply, and if you like, you can check out our video that I did on creating a 9-volt power supply. This is going to have a special function, however, in the fact that the 9-volt is going to be able to be recharged. And that's all there is with this. Just the single screw holds it down. I was lucky enough that this particular unit basically grabs onto the standoff nice and tight. So it's just a matter of keeping it in place. So now, having the power supply in this position, I wanted the switch for the power supply, or to turn the power supply on and off on the side here. The problem is that this lead doesn't quite reach to the switch. So I did have to put a little pigtail on it, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to wire nut these together. There's no reason to get real fancy with it. Now, as you can see, the switch fits nicely right here, and we'll secure that. We'll likely just glue that in with some hot glue. Also, I only cut a large enough hole for basically the switch itself. I didn't actually cut the entire switch body out because I wanted because this particular switch is a a little long, and I wanted to recess it a little bit, and so that's why I'm mounting this on the inside and just cutting a hole for the switch itself to poke through. Makes a little cleaner look that way. Although, if you can call these cuts clean, well, I suppose you could be the judge of that. On the other end of the power supply here, I just put on male end pin connectors, and those will plug into a USB header. So continuing on with the side here, I'm going to use a micro USB panel mount adapter, and this goes from a panel mount to a regular micro USB, and this is what we'll use to charge the battery. So we're just going to mount this right here, and using a couple of black nylon screws to match the side of the case. Wherever we place the battery, this cord will connect to the charger on the battery, and we just plug a micro USB into it, and we can charge the battery up without taking the unit apart. So let's keep going with the power supply. The next thing we're going to do, the power supply output is going to be placed right here. We'll take this, and it's red to red, yellow to black, and this one has two blacks on it. I'm just going to use the fourth one. So just like that. And I'm going to use these silver screws to mount this here. And there we go. That is the internal power supply all hooked up. So the Raspberry Pi is going to go in pretty easily. It just sets into place. And I did not make any permanent mounts for it. I may do that in the future. For now, however, for the sake of time, we are going to get our hot glue gun on. I'm just going to put a couple of dabs here and maybe one over here just to kind of keep it in place. But for the most part, I'm just going to put it in temporarily. There we go. That's not going to go anywhere. Now for the switch. Now this is going to be a little tricky. We want this in a pretty precise position. Switch moves freely. It's not out of place. Not touching anything. Looks like we're good to go there. So that's that side panel done. Now, so the last part is these two USB ports. I could have done this with a single USB, but having the extra USB port allowed me a little extra flexibility. So what it is, the way I've got this wired up, this pigtail goes into the main board. But as you can see, these are separate. So the keyboard coming in here and the pigtail coming out, these are obviously separate lines. They're going to separate USBs. So I can connect the keyboard externally to a PC. I can also connect a keyboard up to the system externally, so I can use a different keyboard if I want to. But how do you use the keyboard with the system itself? This keyboard with this system, if they're two separate lines? Well, we just use the USB cable, the A to A USB cable, and plug it into both of the ports, and that sort of acts like a switch so that we can tell the keyboard you're going to be connected to the C64 board. Now I can also take this keyboard and I can also connect it to the Pi. I can connect it to a PC. I can do whatever I want, really. But what I'm going to do is I don't have any more silver screws, but I have plenty of these nylon screws, and they kind of go with the black, so that's what I'm going to use. Now, ideally, I would like to have the keyboard I want to have on top. I want the Pi interface on the bottom. I would like to have them all going the same direction. Flip that over. There we go. So now let's go ahead and put these two cases together. Okay, so we didn't quite clear one tiny peg. Clearing one, but not the other. So I'm going to have to clip off a couple of these tabs in order to get the clearance I need. So just to show you those two tabs right there. This one and this one. Because we added this to the side, there wasn't enough. Those tabs were actually holding the case open. Beautiful. That should go together just fine now. Alright, I guess the only thing left to do is test it. Okay, moment of truth time. Let's give this thing a test. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to test the C64's basic functions. So I've got my USB A to A cable connected to the two USB ports so that this keyboard will work with the C64. And we're going to output it to this monitor. Let's go ahead and turn that on. Oh, let's plug it in first. That'd be a good idea. There we go. I'm just going to plug it into the mains power right now. Red light is good. And there we go. Got the joystick hooked up. That's good. Let's go into basic so that we can test the keyboard. That's looking good. Okay, so the keyboard works as it always has. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to connect the Raspberry Pi up, and I've already run the HDMI cable. I've run the keyboard cable from the keyboard USB port around to the Pi, and I've also connected up a USB mouse to the Pi as well. Now my USB power supply runs at about 4.82 volts, so we're gonna see the low power warning on the screen when we plug this in. So just be advised of that. We're not going to run it for very long. We're just going to do it and boot it up quick and be done. Now some may be wondering why I used a Raspberry Pi 3 instead of a Raspberry Pi 4. I seriously thought about using a Raspberry Pi 4. I have a couple of them. The thing is that there are a couple of other projects that I have in mind that are going to use the Raspberry Pi 4s, and I really don't need that much processing power in this. Additionally, I wanted to have all the same power connectors. I wanted to have all the same HDMI connectors. So that's why I went with the Raspberry Pi 3. Plus, there's one more project that I'm planning to do with this that will be announced later. We're not doing it today, but it should be fun. So let's see. It's asking me for the wallet password, so we kept it simple. There we go. Don't know why it thinks I need to log into my own network, but let's just open up Terminal here. Hopefully you can see that. At least hopefully you can see it typing. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. Nice and big there. So, keyboard is working. As expected, the C64 key is behaving like a Windows key. Pretty much everything is as expected. There we go. So, keyboard's working with the Raspberry Pi. Excellent. Only one more thing to test, and that's what this cable is for. So let's go ahead and I'm going to shut this down and we'll give our power supply a test. To show you, let's use the other hand. Show you the we've got the switch here, we've got the input power here, and this is to charge the rechargeable cell. And this is a 9-volt 800 milliamp hour battery connected to our power supply. And the power supply is actually connected to this port here and that port there. Okay, so that port there is connected to the this green cable here. And of course it's got to be green. It just has to. So we're going to run the C64 off of the internal power supply. So we've got to switch it on and power it up. Red light's good. That's always a positive thing. There we go. And as you can see, we're not powering it off of the primary power supply here. All right, so we're up and running on the battery. Everything looks good. Get plenty of power. We should, at 800 milliamp hours, we should have a little over 2 hours of runtime. The C64 draws a pretty steady 333 milliamps. It goes up and down a little bit, but for the most part, 333 milliamps. Hopefully it won't suck at this too bad. Ah. Oh, I missed one. That's terrible. Almost. Oh. Yeah, still pretty terrible. But hey, aside from the HDMI cord, we're basically cordless here. So man, this was a fun project. I really enjoyed modifying this C64. We added a lot of functionality to it. We took everything we learned in the last couple of weeks and applied it to a project. Now, I'll give you a little bit of an up-close and personal view of the exterior. Raspberry Pi. The cuts are pretty rough. And honestly, if I had to do it over again, the one thing I would change is this. Instead of having this port, I just completely eliminate this. I would just have the one keyboard port, and this would be the power port. So the keyboard port would connect up to an existing port on the C64 instead of adding an extra port to it. But it's a real minor complaint, all things considered. This was a very difficult project and took a very long time. But like I said, I'm pretty happy with the results. Thing I have to remember now, and I almost forgot taking it off the bench, is currently the switch is in the off position. If you leave the switch on in that position, essentially, you're draining the battery inside because you're leaving the circuit energized. So I have to remember to switch that little switch off in order not to drain the battery. Now, this charge port, as you saw, connects up to the back of the battery. I chose that battery specifically because it has overcharge protection and it has overdraw protection as well. So if you leave it plugged in, the battery will not continuously charge and ruin the battery. It will only continue to discharge up to a certain point. So if you run it all the way down, you're actually not running it all the way down. You're you're leaving a few percent in the battery so that there's no damage to the actual battery itself, which is really nice, because I don't intend to open this back up again. The other thing is, obviously I used a Raspberry Pi 3, and I mentioned earlier that it's because I don't need a lot of horsepower, and there's another project that I may do with this case next year that requires a Raspberry Pi 3. The other thing is I wanted all the ports to be the same. I wanted the charging ports, the power ports to be the same. So if I ran it off of a battery, I only need one cable, and it draws less power than the Pi 4. The Raspberry Pi 3 only draws 350 milliamps of power, whereas the Pi 4 draws 550, and I'm only running it off of that one little rechargeable 9-volt. So in order to get the maximum battery life, I needed it to draw less power. But for the moment, that's it for this video. We have a lot more planned through the end of the year. We have one video coming out every Thursday at 8 a.m. Central Time, and we have quite a few videos planned that are just going to knock your socks off, I think. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Don't miss a single video, and we'll see you in the next one. Animal rating turkey. Yeah, that was pretty bad.